thank you for that introduction. And in fact, it actually anticipates some of the first part of my talk today, interestingly enough. I am deeply honored to have been selected to deliver one of the 2008 Nebraska lectures as a part of the Chancellor's Distinguished Lecture Series. I also appreciate all of the professional development opportunities that the University of Nebraska-Lincoln has afforded me. But before I talk about how quilts reflect trade, technology, and tradition, let me give you a little more background about myself and my journey to this point in my academic career. Those of you who know me well know that I have held a lifelong interest in textiles, all aspects of textiles, their design, their history, the science, and therefore, when I enrolled as a freshman at Virginia Tech, I decided to major in fashion design, as Chancellor Perlman mentioned. And thinking, as so many young students do, I guess, that I wanted to be a fashion designer. However, by the end of my junior year, and 2 years, a year of inorganic chemistry and a year of organic chemistry later, I realized that textile science and a career in college teaching and research better suited my interests. And so I decided to go immediately on to graduate school. And Florida State University offered me a graduate assistantship and had a well-known textile science program. So I accepted its offer, and while there, I completed additional coursework minoring in organic chemistry to further strengthen my background. But I also took a number of courses in the art department, primarily in weaving and textile design. And that proved to be a very good decision, because when I completed my master's degree, my first college teaching job as an instructor involved teaching both textile design courses and textile science courses. Now, that is not a usual combination, as you can imagine, but it was a perfect fit for me because it allowed me to continue to explore and teach about textiles from both a scientific and a design perspective. My research interests over the years in textile science then have remained focused primarily on two things: improving textile and apparel product performance and in protecting museum textiles from the damaging effects of light. My historical interests focus on facets of American textile history, as Chancellor Perlman mentioned, especially those that expand our knowledge of the contributions of women to social history and American history. My textile science and textile conservation research regarding ways to prevent fading in natural dyes eventually led to a redefinition of the ideal light filter for museums. My research demonstrated that exposure to visible light, as well as ultraviolet light, caused significant fading of natural dyes. It had been believed that it was just primarily ultraviolet light that we needed to filter out, but that was not true. Visible light, any light, caused significant fading of natural dyes, which are found in most museum textiles. So we knew then that it was not enough to merely shield them using a UV filter over the fluorescent lights. The UV filtering sleeves needed to be tinted amber to filter out some of the most damaging blue rays of the visible spectrum. Consequently, now, almost all UV shields for fluorescent tubes contain a slight yellowish tint, and some of them do contain the amber tint that you see pictured here on the filter for fluorescent lights on your right. More recently, my research has focused on the evaluation of quilting products that contain adhesives. such as spray adhesives, fusible webs, and fusible battings. This seemed an appropriate new research direction as the director of an academic center devoted to quilt studies. The spray adhesives are marketed to quilters to help them more quickly, quote, baste their quilt tops, battings, and backings together in preparation for quilting. Fusible webs such as Stitch Witchery, Heat and Bond, and Wonder Under are used extensively by some quilters for applique techniques, and as you can see by some of the advertising copy found on the packaging, the manufacturers have a number of interesting and questionable advertising ploys. Fusible battings are another adhesive-based product as well, used by quilt makers seeking to save time in the basting process prior to actual quilting. Well, these adhesive-containing quilting products had never been evaluated by an independent lab. Quilters were bombarded by advertising claims, but had no scientific information on which to make informed choices. Scientists and conservators know that the choice of materials influence the lifespan of an object, and textile conservators and conservation scientists were very suspicious that these new products, despite what the advertisers claimed, were damaging to textiles or would be damaging to them long term. So I decided that I would encourage some of my graduate students to explore this, and interested one of my doctoral students in the project. I won't go into detail this afternoon about the experimental design and methods, but as you might have guessed, the findings confirmed that indeed most all of these adhesive products were damaging. All except the fusible battings caused significant yellowing of the fabrics or significant strength losses. Consequently, it was clear that quilters should avoid using them, and especially if they hoped the item they were making would become a family heirloom. In addition, we would recommend that museum staff and serious collectors avoid purchasing quilts made using adhesive sprays and fusible webs, because their investment is at risk long term if those products are available. In fact, there was just an article recently in, I believe it was the Wall Street Journal, that mentioned that many items that are stored in the Smithsonian Institution made in the 20th century, that even with the resources they have available, they cannot save the items made from many of the plastics in the 20th century. And that includes many of the spacesuits. I shared this information with my colleagues in the Textile Society, the Textile Specialty Group of the American Institute for Conservation. And I also shared it with quilt makers by publishing a lay version of the findings in Quilter's Newsletter magazine, which has a circulation of more than 250,000. When quilters heard about it, it became quite a hot topic on internet discussion groups. In fact, some studio quilters who used the fusible webs and basting sprays extensively were not particularly happy that I published the work. In fact, a few of them claimed that I was destroying their business. Nevertheless, most quilters appreciated learning about the research findings, and most importantly, they can now make informed decisions. They may make quilts where they'll say, sure, this is fine. I'm making it for a children's quilt that I expect to be used and reused, and that is fine. It's okay if they make that decision, as long as it's an informed decision. And I have given permission for numerous versions, or not numerous versions, I've given permission to numerous guilds to post the article or publish it in their guild newsletters. So I'm happy to say it is being well disseminated. Although my academic career began as a textile scientist, I became acquainted with the historical method during my doctoral studies when I minored in American history. My scholarship in the area of textile history has focused primarily on American quilts, largely because of just all-consuming activities that have swept me along since I came to Nebraska. As some of you in the audience know, I became involved in the Nebraska Quilt Documentation Project soon after I joined the faculty of the University of Nebraska in the mid-'80s. As Chancellor Perlman mentioned, it was a grassroots documentation project initiated by the Lincoln Quilters Guild and funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. It was dedicated to preserving information about quilts in private hands before they were sold to dealers and collectors out of the state, and the information about who made them and where they were made and when was forever lost. The scholarship expanded our knowledge about Nebraska history, particularly the quilt-making practices of Nebraska women from the 1870s to the 1940s. You can imagine how thrilled all of us in the Nebraska Quilt History Project were when Nebraska Quilts won the Smithsonian's Frost Prize. Participating in that project was one of the most rewarding projects of my life, and as, again, Chancellor Perlman mentioned, affected my academic career from that point forward. Although society often regards history and science as representing two entirely different cultures, in fact, scientists and historians themselves may sometimes feel this way, that their methodologies and their approaches to scholarship are so different that they virtually speak different languages. However, as I learned more about historical analysis, I was struck more by the parallels between the scientific method and historical analysis than their differences. And because I came to appreciate both approaches and became comfortable with both, I began and continue to employ both approaches in my work, and my academic career has been enriched and fueled by both of them. Let me describe some of the parallels that I see. First, in both paradigms, you must formulate questions or formulate hypotheses to guide your inquiry. Historians may be more likely to formulate a research question, it's true, whereas scientists may be more likely to formulate a null hypothesis. Nevertheless, both historians and scientists must use one or the other to guide their research. Another parallel that I see in the work of an historian and the research of a scientist is that historians corroborate their evidence by following the general rule of having at least two independent and reliable sources before accepting historical information as fact, whereas scientists replicate their experiments 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or more times to demonstrate their repeatability. So, both historians and scientists are engaged in corroboration or replication to ensure the credibility of their work. And finally, historians are concerned with the external and internal criticism of their sources. Historians ask, is the document or the artifact authentic? And is the source creditable, or is the object representative? Scientists are concerned with the external and internal validity of their experimental data. They ask, are the findings representative and generalizable? And did the experimental treatments really make a difference? Or were the differences due to chance or experimental error? The parallel concerns, external and internal criticism and external and internal validity, were striking to me again. So, my involvement in and appreciation for both science and history led me to become very interested in material culture studies, where the focus was on an object, on what an object can tell us about itself in lieu of or in addition to what the written records tell us about an object. Most women left few records prior to the 20th century. Consequently, the objects they made are some of the best documents from which to glean insights into the lives of ordinary women. One of the best definitions of material culture studies is given by Jules Prown, Professor Emeritus of the History of Art at Yale, who said, "The study of material culture is the study of materials to understand culture, to discover the beliefs, the values, ideas, attitudes, and assumptions of a particular community or society at a given time. Material culture is thus an object-based branch of cultural history." He goes on to point out that the underlying premise is that human-made objects reflect consciously or unconsciously the beliefs of the individuals who commissioned, fabricated, purchased, or used them, and by extension, the beliefs of the larger society. Material culture is thus an object-based branch of cultural anthropology or cultural history. E. McClung Fleming proposed the first model for artifact analysis, and it remains a classic today, and it's the one that my students and I use again and again, so I just want to share it very briefly with you. It involves two parts: a 5-step classification process in which you examine the object and answer the following questions. What is its history? What are the materials from which it's made? How was it constructed? What's the object's design or style? What was the object's function? And by carefully examining the object to answer these questions, a rich description of the object is created. And then the next part of the analysis that Fleming recommends is to perform the following 4 operations. Identification. What is it? What is this object? And is it authentic? And evaluate it. How good an example is this? Cultural analysis. What does the object tell us about the society in which it was made? And finally, take it to the level of interpretation. What does it mean to us today? What is this object's significance? As a textile scientist, I appreciated the examination and analysis of a textile artifact, and since material culture scholars advocated using all scientific methods of analysis available for the study of objects, I knew that students and scholars in the area of textiles, textile science, and design were uniquely positioned to employ material culture methodologies in the study of historic textiles and dress. Most departments of textiles introduce both design students as well as textile science students to fiber microscopy and fiber identification techniques, as well as the analysis of yarn, fabric construction analysis, and so forth, all in our introductory textiles course. In addition, we generally require majors to take 1 semester, if not 1 year, of chemistry. What better preparation could anyone have for the analysis of historic textiles from a material culture model of study? Therefore, I decided to introduce a material culture methodologies course, graduate course, a course devoted to the study of textiles and dress from this perspective. And I also employed material culture models of study more and more in my own research, as did my graduate students as soon as they were introduced to it. So let me tell you about a few of the fascinating discoveries my graduate students my professional staff at the International Quilt Study Center, and I have made regarding quilts in the International Quilt Study Center's collections using this wonderful material cultures studies approach. When Melissa Stewart Jurgena selected this quilt for an assignment in the material culture studies class, we did not even have an estimated date for it. Oh, we knew that it was probably made sometime in the 19th century, but a 100-year span is not what we usually like to have for an estimated date. And we were unsure where it was made. I always select quilts with very limited, if any, information about them for the material culture studies artifact analysis assignment so that students are forced to learn what the quilt can reveal about itself. Now, of course, it makes a lot more sense and seems more worthwhile to ask students to research an object that needs the research and that will lead to a richer understanding of it rather than to select one that we already know a lot about. This quilt is a signature quilt, and we thought it likely was a friendship quilt because of the many signatures in the center of each block. Friendship quilts were a popular tradition in the mid-19th century in America, often made by groups of friends and family members for an individual who was moving west. Customarily, each block was made by a different friend or family member and signed by that individual. Then the blocks were completed, or a completed quilt was presented as a going-away gift. The only clues to this quilt's history, other than the inked signatures, was a small penciled note attached to its back that read, quote, "This quilt was made by the ladies of South Appalachian for Aunt Jane Blair, sister of Asha Bancroft Moe, mother of Lucy Moe Wood, mother of Roy Wood." That was it. That was really quite a bit, though, as it turned out. While Melissa formally analyzed the quilt according to Fleming's model, her analysis of the quilt indicated that the fabrics represented the 1845 to 1865 era, so she was able to narrow it down to a 20-year time frame based on the fabrics and the patterns and the colors of the cotton fabrics used. Upon closer examination, we noticed that the overall layout of the quilt was ingeniously planned and constructed so that each, quote, friendship block shares a corner with its surrounding blocks. Now think about that. That unusual construction meant that it was unlikely that the blocks were constructed by different individuals, as previously presumed, and later sewn together. You just couldn't do that. Rather, each of the blocks appears to have been made and assembled by a single maker. The complicated layout of the quilt clearly suggested one person rather than a group of persons, contrary to that small handwritten note that was attached to the quilt. So with the initial examination of the quilt, its fabrics, its construction complete, and with the material evidence contradicting the documentary evidence that we had on the penciled note, we decided to shift attention to the names appearing on the signature blocks. Melissa thought a more complete list of names might enable her to establish other connections between the individuals that would lead to insights. However, most of the signatures were so faded they were impossible to read. But that didn't stop Melissa. She took images of the signature blocks with a digital camera, ran them through photo editing software, and this process made it possible to change the contrast and brightness, making the signatures show up much more clearly, and thus she made the names readable. This not only enabled her to assemble a list of the names on the quilt, but in the process she noticed that the signatures appeared to have been written in the same hand, rather than being the signed blocks of many individuals as had previously been assumed. Using this roster of names, she searched for South Appalachian and found that the town no longer existed. But a South Appalachian did exist in the mid-19th century in south-central New York near the Pennsylvania border. So this led to a search of South Appalachian area cemetery records, census records, marriage records, and newspaper files that fortuitously the County Historical Society had posted on the internet. Melissa had spectacular results. She not only found more information about the individuals who supposedly made the quilt, she located Jane Bancroft Blair's home when she traveled to New York over her spring break to continue the research. She'd already finished the paper, submitted the paper as it was as it existed as much as she could at the end of the course in December, but she was so fascinated that she decided to continue her work over spring break. And even more exciting in that spring break trip, she discovered that the diaries of this woman had survived in an attic, untouched for almost a century. The present owner of the home was not a descendant, but he agreed to give all the diaries to a descendant living nearby, who subsequently generously donated all of them to the University of Nebraska libraries. So we're fortunate to now have them in our collections here. When the final count was made, there were 32 diaries ranging in date from 1859 to 1900. Mercy Jane was an unusual woman. She did leave quite a lengthy document behind. Unusual for her time, and unusual today for anyone to keep a diary for almost 40-some years. Mercy Jane made many references to quilts and quilting in her diary during the months preceding her engagement to be married. The handwriting in the diaries matched the handwriting on the signature blocks, so we now knew who had signed the blocks. Further examination of the diary entries revealed that Mercy Jane made her own friendship quilt to remember the people from her hometown, since she would be moving away from South Appalachian when she married. With this information in hand, we now knew that this quilt was made in 1863 and was not a traditional friendship quilt, though it was a friendship quilt of sorts. Well, many more fascinating details were teased out of the quilt and the diaries, and the entire research story is published in the annual monograph of the American Quilt Study Group. This quilt, I think you'll agree, provides an excellent example of the valuable insights gleaned from interdisciplinary research. This quilt provides another example of the richer understanding gained by interdisciplinary study, combining artifact analysis with traditional historical analysis. Lucinda Ward Honstein's remarkable pictorial album quilt first came to widespread public attention when it sold for a record price at Sotheby's in October of 1991. Nancy Druckman, Sotheby's Director of American Folk Art, described it as one of the finest pieces of Americana to come across her desk. Subsequently, it appeared in a number of publications as the Reconciliation Quilt. It was so called because of the block depicting the release of the Confederate President Jefferson Davis from prison. In the block, she depicts him being reunited with his daughter, as you can see in the detail. His release from prison, rather than his execution for treason, was regarded by many in the North as an extraordinarily magnanimous gesture, and hence the name, the Reconciliation Quilt. The quilt became widely known and appreciated by American folk art dealers, collectors, and scholars as a quintessential example of American folk art. Yet, its origins remain largely uninvestigated and its imagery almost entirely unexamined and unexplained. Research into the census records, newspaper accounts, and a careful examination of the quilt itself led to a different appreciation for this spectacular quilt, which, by the way, is now on view at the International Quilt Study Center in its inaugural exhibitions. The full story of this quilt is told in an article that I co-authored with one of my former graduate students and published in Folk Art magazine. We now know that this exceptional piece provides a pictorial diary of one woman's life during a turbulent time in history. Our research showed that she lived near the shipyards in Brooklyn, as suggested by some of the details on the quilt, that her husband was an Army officer, and that she accompanied him to a number of forts where he was stationed, hence the number of soldiers depicted on her quilt. With needle and thread, Lucinda Honstein commemorated her life, recorded family memories, and stitched a pictorial narrative that reflected her patriotic and her abolitionist sentiments. At the same time, she created an enduring masterpiece that embodies the essence of the Northern experience during the period. She clearly celebrated the end of the Civil War and hoped for the period of reconciliation that would follow, or hoped for a period of reconciliation that would follow. Another example, one of the most overlooked and yet potentially important aspects of any sewn item is the thread with which it's sewn. Sewing thread has undergone many changes through time as a result of technological advances, including the invention of the sewing machine. The sewing machine, in fact, came into the world with no thread ready for it. None had the strength, the fineness, and the uniformity required by this new invention, this new machine. It took them almost 10 years to get a thread ready for it. Around the mid-19th century, a new sewing thread was perfected called six-cord thread. It was constructed differently from previous threads. It was finer and it had more plies and were twisted together in a different way. These changes in structure are visible to a trained, discerning eye, and consequently, sewing thread can really prove to be an important tool in determining the age of a quilt. Let me share one example. A number of years ago, another one of my former graduate students, Jenny Uris, now curator of collections at the North Dakota Historical Society, studied a group of quilts for her graduate exhibition project. One of them, a Baltimore album quilt, like the one you see here, presented very confusing clues as to its probable date of manufacture. Baltimore album quilts, like this one, were usually made between 1845 and 1855, quite a narrow window of time. However, this quilt contains six-cord sewing thread. Now, six-cord sewing thread was that new, stronger sewing thread developed for the sewing machine that was supposedly developed around 1860, which was 5 to 10 years after the Baltimore album quilts were supposed to be made. While it was possible that the quilt was sewn and quilted in the 1860s after the Baltimore fad had faded, another possibility was that six-cord thread was available earlier than previously thought by textile historians. Jenny and I decided to pursue that question. First, we examined all the pre-1860 date-inscribed quilts in the IQSC's collections to see if we could find any other examples of quilts containing six-cord thread. We each examined the thread separately and then compared our findings. Corroboration, so important. Out of 24 quilts that the center held in 1998, there were 24 with inscribed dates, and the dates inscribed on them range from 1841 to 1859. Out of those 24 quilts, 9 contained 6-cord sewing thread. 9. Yet, according to the best scholarship available at that time, according to the foremost textile historian at the Smithsonian Institution, the curator of textiles, 6-cord threads were not available until 1860. But clearly, they were available. Object-based study revealed that there they were. So we began to search for early documents pertaining to the development and introduction of sewing threads. Upon further research into 19th century publications and documents, Jenny discovered an article in the Scientific American dated 1850. And in that article, they reported that a new 6-cord thread was introduced that year. This article and some additional supporting documentation indicated that the new, stronger, finer 6-cord sewing thread had been introduced almost 10 years earlier than previous scholarship had suggested. This corroborated what object-based study had revealed and clearly refuted the previous scholarship. This discovery has informed our examination of quilts from that time forward. If we are uncertain about whether a quilt is a pre-1850s quilt or not, one of the first things we'll do is examine the sewing threads to determine whether or not it contains 6-cord sewing thread. If it does, we know it could not have been made before 1850. Stylistic analysis could not yield such a definitive clue. Only technical analysis can yield such definitive evidence. Technical analysis such as this sewing thread analysis or fiber microscopy. And mentioning fiber microscopy, now Nomura performed fiber microscopy on every fabric in each quilt in the Barber collection of Mifflin County Amish quilts. Now was a graduate student who came to Nebraska from Tokyo with a background in American studies. She entered the program to strengthen her background in textile analysis and history and minored in museum studies while here. She discovered in the course where fiber microscopy was introduced that she loved it. And so she undertook this project analyzing the 38 Amish quilts in the Barber collection. Her in-depth study proved very useful in corroborating and sometimes refuting the estimated date assigned to each of these quilts by the dealer or collector. We have found over the years, as everyone knows, you really need to corroborate any dealer or collector assigned date with additional research. But this one really opened our eyes. As a result of her technical analysis, nearly 1/3 of the Barber collection had to be assigned dates later than originally estimated by the dealer and collector, due to the presence of various manufactured fibers, including nylon, polyester, and rayon. For example, this 9-patch quilt came into the collection with a dealer assigned date of circa 1935. We found that most of the fabrics were cotton polyester blends. Polyester wasn't invented until the 1950s, so we knew it couldn't have been made before the mid-1950s. Consequently, we conservatively reassigned it a circa date of 1960 to 1970. This Amish quilt, also from the Barber collection, was originally assigned a date circa 1930. Even though we had a maker's name and the county in Pennsylvania, we couldn't locate the maker in census records for the period 1930. However, when Miss Nomura discovered that the quilt was pieced using a nylon sewing thread, we knew it had been made much later than the dealer estimated date. Searching for Leah Yoder in later records, we found her and now contacted her and actually another graduate student, Janniken Schmucker, interviewed her and learned that the quilt was not made until the 1980s, nearly 50 years later than first estimated by the collector. Of course, this was somewhat disappointing to us and embarrassing to the collector, but it certainly does demonstrate the usefulness of fiber microscopy for more accurately estimating the dates of quilts. Much more reliable than dealer or collector estimated dates, more definitive than stylistic analysis, which was what the dealer or collector presumably or charitably had used. Although fiber microscopy is the most important tool for technical analysis that we employ, another useful tool is examination of quilts under a black light. Quilting threads containing optical brighteners fluoresce when examined under a black light, which is just an ultraviolet light. Since optical brighteners or fluorescent whitening agents, whichever name you like know them by, came into widespread use after 1950, if the threads or fabrics fluoresce in a quilt, then you know the quilt was completed after 1950. Well, as you can see, the quilting threads in this quilt top emit a fluorescent glow. This is shown in the image on your right, which is the very same quilt top under black light as the quilt you see on your left. Although the top, when we just examined the top, it appears to have been made during the late 19th century, based simply on the fabrics that were used. But as soon as it was examined under black light, it was clear that the quilting was done more recently. Examination under a black light is one of the simplest and most decisive means of detecting repairs or quilting completed after 1950. Well, that concludes the examples I wanted to share with you to give you some idea of the ways quilts reflect technology, as well as the ways technical analysis informs the study of quilts, and how scholarship can be enriched by the study of objects using an interdisciplinary approach involving science and history. Now I'd like to show you just a few examples of quilts from the International Quilt Study Center's collections and briefly describe how they reflect trade and tradition as well as technology. The earliest quilts in the center's collection date from the early 18th century. This whole cloth quilt is typical of the style of bed quilts made in Europe during this period. Women's petticoats, men's waistcoats were also quilted in this fashion. Quilting stitches created the design in these early quilts, and the detailed image on your right gives you some idea of the extraordinary needlework skills employed by this maker. Patchwork, which we so often think of when we think of quilts, was rare during the 18th century. This cutout chintz quilt, dated 1809, is the earliest dated American example in our collections. It represents a style of the early 1800s, chintz applique in a central medallion format. You see, there were changing fashions in quilts, just as in clothing, and these stylistic changes over time reflect changes in technology and trade and artistic influences as well as fashion. Why a central medallion format during this period? Tradition. The medallion format was popular in the British Isles, from which many of America's earliest settlers immigrated. They were familiar with this style, and they continued to make it after they arrived in their new country. They clung to tradition. The chintz applique that you see on this quilt reflects trade. The chintz fabrics used in this quilt were expensive and were imported from either India or Europe during this period. The United States' fledgling textile industry of the early 1800s could not produce printed fabrics of this quality. This maker was clearly a woman of means who could afford imported cotton fabrics and the time to devote to such fancy needlework. Signature quilts in a pieced block format like this one became a popular style during the second quarter of the 19th century. This one served as a source of design inspiration for our first fabric line, aptly called My Sweet Sister Emma, because it contains the cross-stitched inscription that you see here. Prior to the advent of permanent inks, women marked their textiles using embroidery, sometimes only a cross-stitched number, just to keep track of it within her inventory of household textiles. And sometimes she made more extensive markings, as you see here. This close-up gives you some idea of the detailed inscriptions and intricately inked drawings on the Sweet Sister Emma quilt. There are more than 100 inked signatures on it. As I mentioned earlier, signature quilts rose in popularity between the 1840s and 1860s, when many Americans were leaving their homes in the East to seek land and new opportunities in the West. Many of these signature quilts were made to provide a loved one with an object to remember their family and friends that they were leaving behind and likely would never see again. This Baltimore album quilt is one of the collection's finest. It's currently on view in the Quilt Museum's inaugural exhibition. Baltimore album quilts are built of blocks featuring spectacular needlework, and they represent one of the most distinctive regional styles of the 19th century. On this one, the entire feather plume border is done in reverse applique. It's simply astonishing. Moving along in the century, the 19th century, red and green applique quilts were favored by American quilt makers also during the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, and the princess feather was a particularly popular pattern. This Mennonite version of the same pattern illustrates the striking contrast created by the maker's use of dramatic, rich colors. The Mennonites regarded white backgrounds as too showy and too impractical. And so here we see how the maker's religious traditions influenced her color choices, and consequently, the two quilts of the same pattern create strikingly different visual effects, reflecting those different traditions. Log cabin quilts rose in popularity during the last quarter of the 19th century, when inexpensive cotton fabrics became more widely available throughout the United States as well as Europe. Advances in textile technology resulting from the Industrial Revolution meant by the mid-1800s there was a dizzying array of cotton calicos in a variety of patterns and prices. An abundance of fabric, coupled with the invention of the sewing machine, is believed to have contributed to that explosion of quilt making in the 19th century, for which American quilt makers are known yet today. The log cabin pattern has proven to be a perennial favorite for pieced block style quilts. Finally, crazy quilts were the other popular style during the last quarter of the 19th century. They captured the imagination of thousands of women during the 1880s and 1890s. Most crazy quilts were made for show and were usually made of silk fabrics, lavishly embroidered with a variety of stitches. They were meant to be draped over a sofa, a table, a piano in a Victorian parlor, never intended for bed. This style of quilt became very popular following the Centennial Exhibition in 1876 in Philadelphia, which was organized to celebrate this milestone in U.S. history. Millions, nearly 10 million Americans came to the Centennial Exhibition in 1876. The Japanese pavilion was one of the most popular displays, and it allowed Americans to see textiles and decorative arts from Japan for the first time. Scholars believe the crazy quilt style was sparked in part by the Japanese decorative arts seen here. Oriental fans and figures abound in crazy quilts, and an asymmetrical format for which Japanese artists are noted became the new design format adopted by American women. They even called this the new Japanese style quilt, and it's called that in numerous women's publications of the time. But there was another influence that we now believe also further influenced this new style, and that was exposure to the impressive needlework on view at England's Royal School of Art needlework display. Millions of Americans also flocked to this pavilion in the Centennial Exhibition, where they were really impressed by the embroiderers of the Royal School who were there demonstrating and left examples. Women experimented with a variety of embroidery stitches on their new crazy quilts, covering the edge of each irregularly shaped fabric patch with creating a veritable sampler of embroidery stitches. And the craze for crazy quilts extended to the Great Plains, though not the high-style silk crazy quilts of the East. Crazy quilts made by women settling the plains more often were made of wool or cotton rather than the impractical silks favored by Eastern women. I did say more often. There were some exceptions, but more often women of the plains did use the cottons and wools. And typically the embroidery was not as elaborate, presumably due to less time for fancy work. And though there are many more examples, as you can well imagine, with more than 2,500 quilts or 2,600 quilts in our collection, I'm going to conclude with this crazy quilt that reflects the sensibility and the resources available to one woman of the plains at the end of the 19th century. I hope that the examples I have shared will inspire more interdisciplinary collaboration and discoveries. Clearly, when the intersections of science, history, and art are explored, amazing information can be uncovered. In closing, I want to acknowledge my graduate students and research associates over the past 20-some years, as well as the staff of the International Quilt Study Center, the women of the Nebraska Quilt Documentation Project, and my colleagues in the Department of Textiles, Clothing, and Design. They have all contributed mightily to the success of the research projects, exhibitions, and publications that I highlighted today. And that concludes my lecture. Come see firsthand how quilts reflect trade, technology, and tradition by visiting the new museum, where we have two fabulous exhibitions on view with a number of the quilts that you just saw on view for a limited time only, just until August. Thank you.